There are a bunch of different types and categories of damage that can be caused and unfortunately felt in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. My name is Dawn. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and talk about it. So, a good place to look for all the damage types in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is in the core rulebook, specifically on page 452, and that's where we're going to be getting a lot of this information. These generally are categorized into physical damage, energy damage, alignment damage, mental damage, poison damage, bleed damage, precision damage, and then a special type of precious metals for certain types of monsters. We're going to describe the general categories, and I am going to be giving some specific examples, but the examples I'm giving aren't absolute. There are so many different types and categories and individual cases and spells that could cause these types of damage. So I'm going to try to give specific examples across a range of categories, but not every specific example for every type of damage. It would just be an immense undertaking that I don't think anybody would want to watch through. Now, the other thing I want to say is I'm going to give these examples as much as I can from the experience of a player. I don't want to do it from a creature or a monster aspect, mainly because I don't want to give out spoilers. Game masters might be viewing this video, and I'm more than happy for that, but I don't want to ruin something that you have been planning for 3 years just because I used that as an example. So one of your player characters might know that it does this particular damage type. So I'm going to try to keep it from the player character's perspective. But the one thing I will say is with the rules of Pathfinder is that the damage is pretty universal. So whatever works for a player, it works the same way for all creatures. So it does definitely translate. Another thing I would like to say is that all these types of damage can have modifiers. And by modifiers, I mean you can have resistances to certain types of damage and you can have immunities to certain types of damage. So it's something to keep in mind when you're planning your attacks or planning your combat, both as a player and as a game master for the players you're going against. And there are things that exist within the system in order to help you identify what these resistances and immunities are. Things like recall knowledge. Thermitages have certain spells and certain abilities that they do in order to find out more about creatures that they're coming up against. So I encourage everybody to use what is available to you in order to learn what these resistances, weaknesses, immunities, what all these things could be. It'll definitely help the play. It gives you more things to do as you're playing and as you're fighting. And it also will increase your knowledge as you continue through the adventure, because just because you found out what a kobold is weak to in one instant doesn't mean that that doesn't translate as you go further down the road. So these are things that you can kind of bank in your knowledge, and your player would know what these things are. Now, this might be a longer video, so what I'm going to say is I do this on all my videos, but I will break this up into chapters, so it'll be along the bottom on your timeline here, as well as in the description of what all these categories are, and I'll break it into that so it's a little bit easier to swallow. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get into our first category, which is physical damage. Now, physical damage is damage that is dealt by weapons, physical hazards, a few spells, and even things like fists if you're not using weapons at all. It is generally broken up into 3 different categories of damage, and that would be bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. So with bludgeoning damage is basically blunt force trauma. It's things like clubs, maces, staffs, rocks, sling stones, things of those nature. Blunt objects generally don't have an edge, so they don't necessarily cause slices or cuts or pierce. They literally just bludgeon, bruise, and break creatures and bodies, and that is where the damage comes from, but they do not pierce or slash the body. Then once we get into piercing damage is from strikes and punctures. It would be things along the lines of spears, picks, rapiers, daggers, even things like spikes on a shield, things of those nature. What these do is they generally break the skin of the body and go into a body, but they don't necessarily slash or tear at larger areas of skin. I'm not saying that they can't. I'm not saying that they might not have a versatile trait that allows them to do other types of damage, but their main type of damage would be a piercing type of damage. And then slashing damage is something that you think of when you think of the sword fighter, but it would mainly be anything like a long sword. Short swords are generally piercing, but long swords do slashing damage. Axes, scimitars, and even things along the lines of whips all do slashing damage. Slashing damage is damage that is done usually from something that has an edge, or in the whip's case, it's sheer the speed and force of the particular object, and they slice the body in order to cause this slashing damage. In order to see what type of damage your weapon would do, you can get a good start by looking at the tables, which are on page 279 of the core rulebook, and you can see the types of damage that the individual weapons will do in all those various damage tables. There are special magical weapons that are listed further along in the core rulebook, as well as in most other books. So you can definitely look on or in those or on the Archives of Nethys to look up the individual weapons that you might have. But if you look at those tables, you'll get a good idea. The type of damage is usually denoted by a B, P, or S, and it kind of goes along with what you think would be. B stands for bludgeoning damage, P stands for piercing damage, and S stands for slashing damage. You can also look at the weapon in the weapon trait column, which is way over to the side. And if you look for something called versatile, if you see a versatile weapon trait, what that means is that although it has a primary damage type, you can state that you would like to do this versatile type of damage instead. So if you are going against a creature that might have a resistance to slashing damage, and you have a versatile B weapon, a Psi would be a versatile B weapon, you could do bludgeoning damage instead to overcome that resistance. So it is something to keep in mind when you're fighting, and versatile or weapons with the versatile trait are very handy for this type of thing. So as stated, creatures can have immunity to certain types of physical damage. So once again, the variety is always good. Even if it's not versatile, to have a different type of weapon that fits into a different damage category is a good thing to have. And the type of physical damage that you do is sometimes important to monster traits. An example of that doesn't go too far into spoilers would be a creature that is from the ooze category, simply because they have resistances to slashing or piercing. So the versatile Psi or versatile bludgeoning Psi would be very helpful in that category. With that, we're going to go from the physical and we're going to go ahead into energy damage. Now, energy damage can come from many sources: spells, magical weapons, alchemical bombs, and even the environment, like freezing in very cold weather, or going through a burning forest, or a cave that has magma or lava. There are so many different things that can cause energy damage, and the major types of energy damage are acid, cold, electricity, fire, and sonic. So there are many examples I could give, and especially when we start getting to spells, it could get very, very large. But there are spells that cause energy damage, like the electric arc, cone of cold, fireball. Those all cause what you think: electric arc causing electric damage, or cone of cold causing cold damage, or a fireball causing fire damage. But in my mind, and I'm even wearing the little t-shirt here for that, one of the masters of energy damage, or they can cause the most variety of energy damage, are alchemists with their alchemical bombs. They have things like the Lesser Acid Flask, Lesser Alchemist Fire, Bottled Lightning, Frost Vial, Lesser Thunderstone. All these things really show the range of energy attack that are available to players, because even if you aren't the alchemist, you can buy these things and you could use them. Or if you have an alchemist in your party, you could have them be crafted and you could use them as a thrown weapon or as a weapon of some type. So these really show the range as well as the types of particular damage that can happen. And by that, I mean, not only is it the initial attack, there's persistent effects sometimes. These effects can also be added to weapons or objects through runes or spells, like Bespell Weapon, which is available to some classes like sorcerers and wizards. There is also some new things in Treasure Vault, such as ointments and things like that, that can be placed on weapons that only last for a limited amount of time, but do add these types of effects. And there are some special type of energy effects that we need to talk about. And these would be the positive and negative damage types. So positive damage harms undead in general. So that would be the positive damage from a player character against an undead creature, or if you happen to be an undead player character, then you need to watch out for positive damage. A good example of this one would be the cleric spell Disrupt Undead. That does cause positive damage. And then for negative damage, there is an example there for Chill Touch, and Chill Touch harms living creatures. But this also kind of shows you a little special thing here, specifically to Chill Touch. But for these types of damage in total, is that you need to read the spell descriptions, because although negative damage from Chill Touch really does hurt the living, if you cast it against an undead, it still causes a condition effect, or circumstance effect. So make sure you read your descriptions to see what everything does. So although negative does harm living, it does do things in this specific case to undead. So just keep all this in mind to make sure that you're reading everything that you have available to you for these particular types of damage. And now we're going to go ahead and go into alignment damage. Now, alignment damage is a type of damage that a player or a creature can do against whoever they are opposing that causes damage up to the opposing type. And by opposing type, there are 4 types we're going to talk about, and that would be chaotic and evil. And then we have lawful and good. So if you are causing chaotic damage, then that would affect lawful creatures. If you are casting good damage, that would affect evil creatures. So it's always to the opposing one. And they only apply to creatures that have opposing alignment. And that's where the alignment part comes in, is the damage is to alignment. So if you are a true neutral character, you pretty much be immune to these. But true neutral is very hard to pull off. So I don't, that'd be a tough one to do. So chaotic damage harms only lawful creatures. And a good example of that is going to be the rune Archaic. Evil damage harms only good creatures. Another rune I can think of for that would be the Unholy rune that would cause damage to good creatures. Good damage will only harm, as you might think, evil creatures. And a good example for this would be the Champion's Divine Strike. As a redeemer, it would cause good damage against evil creatures. And then a good example for lawful damage that only harms chaotic creatures would be the rune Axiomatic. These particular things are things that you can apply or actions that you can do in order to damage things of an opposite alignment. As you can probably tell, it is pretty specific to circumstance on how these can be used, but when they are usable, they are very effective. So it's a good thing to have, good thing to keep in mind. Champions are very good at this, but it also applies to other spells, actions, feats from other characters. You just need to pay attention to what you have when you're doing your character creation. After this, we're going to go ahead and head on to mental damage. So mental damage affects the mind of the creature or the player character, usually with a psychic force of some time, although not necessarily psychic. And the actual effect of it deals damage to that particular creature. And once again, that'd be categorized as mental damage. An example or a description may be you are imposing a piercing headache on the monster, or a migraine of some sort, or through your actions, you are causing enough internal conflict to the creature or to the player character in order to shear a creature's sense of self. Mindless creatures, or those with only rudimentary intelligence, or programmed creatures, think of automatons, or things of those sort. They're often immune to mental effects because they don't have a mental state to be affected. Some good examples of this would be, once again, you can do mental effects with Bespell Weapon, which is available to various classes, again, sorcerers, wizards. And Crisis of Faith, which is a very good spell that causes doubt and mental turmoil upon a creature. So mental damage is things that affect the creature's mental state. It has to have a mental state in order for it to be effective. With that, let's go ahead and move on to poisons. So poison damage comes from venoms from creatures, like you can think of spider venom, or toxins or compounds like metal poisoning with arsenic or cyanide. They can be applied by contact from weapons or touch. They can be ingested, inhaled, caused by an injury and seeping into the wound itself. Also, coated weapons could also apply these particular poison effects. There are spells that apply poison damage, but generally the spells themselves are imitating a physical object, like a spider sting would imitate a part of a spider in order to apply that poison for the poison damage. And one other thing to really note about poison damage is poison damage usually will have some type of persistent effect, and it's called an affliction. Diseases also fall into this category, but I would look at the affliction section within the core rulebook, which is on page 457, in order to kind of see how this goes. But with a poison, generally speaking, you are going to be rolling on your turn to see if you overcome the poison, as well as taking persistent damage on your turn as well. So poisons are usually, and I'm saying usually, but off the top of my head, I really can't think of one at all, but I'll leave it at usually persistent in their nature. So they're pretty venomous, if you excuse the pun there. So now that we've talked about poisons, let's go ahead and move on to the next one, which is bleed damage. So bleed damage is a special type of physical damage. Bleed damage is persistent damage that represents the loss of blood. So it is a continuing type of damage. And like poisons, it is usually persistent. And you usually have to roll a certain DC on your turn in order to overcome the bleed damage. Certain weapons or creature attacks will have a bleed trait, or they can cause enough damage to have a player consistently bleed turn after turn. A good example might be a particularly deep cut or a particularly ragged cut that does not let the blood flow cease and does not let healing happen. Bleed damage will usually come with a DC that must be rolled on a player's turn to end the bleed state. And it will also cease anytime you are healed to full. If you're healed to full, you have closed the wound and the bleeding will actually stop. So always remember that as soon as you are healed to full, you automatically stop all bleed conditions. Now, bleed damage does not affect non-living creatures. So the undead usually aren't affected by bleed damage. And then there are certain creatures, like maybe creatures in the ooze category that don't have blood. So the bleed condition would not apply to them as well. And there are certain creatures, even if they aren't totally immune, that might have weaknesses to bleeding or might have resistances that can affect this. But that's kind of the same for all these damage categories. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to another special type of damage. We're going to move on to precision damage. Now, precision damage is usually given by a skill, ability, or a weapon trait that allows you to strike with accuracy. And you can think of it as you are hitting a weak point on a creature or in a way that causes additional damage. Precision damage is always the same type of damage as the weapon that caused it. And what I mean by that is you do not track precision damage separately. Precision damage is always going to be the same type as whatever weapon caused it because it just gets added on to. So let's say if you're attacking with a long sword, which is going to cause slashing damage. Well, if you are doing a precise strike with a long sword, you are going to do, let's say you do 6 points of damage with your long sword and 3 points of precision damage. But when marking that against the creature, the GM is going to put that all as slashing damage. So it doesn't separate, it just adds 2. There are immunities to precision damage, and the immunities usually come from the type of creature it is. Specifically, if the creature doesn't have a specific anatomy, going back to the same category, oozes don't have specific anatomy necessarily. So they would have an immunity to precision damage. They don't have immunity to the damage that caused the precision damage. So let's say if you're doing bludgeoning damage and adding precision damage on that. Well, because the creature might not have a specific anatomy, they will still take the bludgeoning damage that they did get, but the precision damage just won't apply to them. So when we say an immunity to precision damage, it's not immunity from the damage that caused the precision damage. It's just the precision damage itself that they are immune to. Resistance to or immunities from physical damage would also be a resistance to precision damage. So if something is immune to slashing damage, then they are also going to be immune to precision damage caused by a slashing weapon. So if they have a resistance or immunity to a certain type of damage, then the precision damage caused by it will also suffer that same resistance or immunity. Some good examples of these would be the backstabber trait, which causes precision damage, and then Hunter's Edge is also a good one that causes precision damage. With that, we're going to go into our last special category, and that would be precious materials. So precious materials aren't really considered their own damage category, but they do modify damage from weapons that already exist or damage types that already exist. And they're used to overcome certain creatures' resistances or immunities. For example, the obvious one that you get from pop culture itself would be silver weapons against werewolves. Silver weapons can damage werewolves and they have a weakness to them. Another good one is cold iron weapons for fae or demons. And by striking with a silver weapon or with a cold iron weapon against creatures that have resistances or immunities to certain types of physical damage, it allows you to break through those physical resistances in order to actually cause damage because you're using the special weapon type that they are used to. So although precious materials, they aren't a type of damage itself, like you're not going to get 6 points of silver damage, the particular materials will allow you to cause damage to creatures that normally would not have these if they have a weakness to that particular precious material. So I hope with this explanation, you might have learned something new on these particular damage types, or we helped clarify something, and I hope you liked it. If you did, I hope you like, subscribe, or maybe hit that notification bell. But whether you do or you don't, I do appreciate your time. I hope you guys have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.